How do you support your arguments? People will often ask you to offer or provide evidence for your claims. Evidence has been called the raw material of argumentation, and that's what we'll focus on today, specifically where evidence occurs in the Toolman Model of argument, a definition of evidence, as well as types of evidence. I'm sure you remember the Toolman Model of argumentation, the first triad, where a claim or a proposition is supported by grounds or data, sometimes called fact, with the warrant providing the reasoning or the connection between the two. Evidence, then, would be considered the grounds or the data. It is used to support a claim. I'm sure you also recall the second triad, which you use when it is necessary to support your initial argument. Here's where you use backing, qualifiers, and rebuttals to shore up or back up your claim, particularly when you're being questioned. Oftentimes that backing takes the form of evidence. For example, if you are claiming that cigarette smoking causes cancer, you may choose to cite testimony from Rear Admiral Boris Lushniak. Now, if your audience has never heard of Lushniak or questions his credibility, you might have to back up your evidence with additional evidence. It's not completely new evidence, but evidence supporting your previously cited evidence. You might say, for example, that we can trust what Lushniak says because, as of this recording, he is the current acting Surgeon General of the United States and thus would be considered by many to be knowledgeable about this issue. In this case, you are using evidence, then, to back up your original evidence. You may also need to back up your warrant, or the reasoning that connects the claim to the grounds, and evidence can be used here also. Let's turn next to the definition of evidence, as facts or conditions objectively observable, beliefs or premises generally accepted as true by the audience, or conclusions previously established. Notice that the defining characteristic of evidence is that it is accepted by the audience and can be used to support statements, arguments, or claims that are not already accepted by the audience. Evidence, then, consists of facts, opinions, and objects that are used to prove or support a conclusion or claim. Evidence is not just examples or statistics. Evidence can also come from personal observations or from observations that are reported or recorded by others. In fact, in many cultures, personal experience and stories are considered to be more valid than statistics. How important is it to use evidence? Researchers who have studied the effects of evidence on the persuasiveness of arguments have found that speakers who are unknown to the audience or who are only moderately respected by an audience tend to be more successful if they use evidence to support their claims. So if you use evidence, it will likely contribute to your audience's perception of you as credible. Considering our previous discussion on evidence as being facts, opinions, or objects, we can turn next to the types of evidence. First, let's consider artifacts. Artifacts are things. Think of artifacts as being physical evidence that a speaker might use to prove a point. Artifacts, then, are things that we can see, feel, experience, etc. In a court of law, attorneys introduce exhibits, which are things. They're using artifacts. If you were to argue that it's too late to go to a movie tonight, for example, you might pull out a newspaper or an app on your phone and point to the show times, or even a clock for that matter. All of these are artifacts. When you cite examples, you are using specific instances. One textbook I consulted labeled this type of evidence as reports and descriptions. Specific instances are non-numerical or narrative accounts of some object or occurrence. And you'll use this type of evidence whenever your argument involves using examples and illustrations. You might want to think of a specific instance as a case study or a story. A special type of specific instance is a hypothetical example. Hypothetical means something might be true. If I were to say something like, well, let's say, for example, you're considering getting married. I don't know if that is the case, but it could be the case. The success of a hypothetical example depends upon the audience considering that it is likely to be the case or could be true. If I were to use that same statement, let's say that you're considering getting married, to a 10-year-old, my subsequent argument would likely be dismissed, as very few 10-year-olds, or at least those 10-year-olds that I happen to know, would consider that a likely scenario at their age. When you combine a large number of real instances, you end up with statistics. Statistics provide a means to talk about a large number of specific instances or examples without having to cite each and every one. These include averages, percentages, totals, or estimates. While specific instances help in establishing the depth of a problem, think about statistics as helping with establishing the breadth. You could use a statistic to claim that we as human beings can detect more than 10,000 different odors. We don't have to list each and every one of them, but somebody probably could. And if pressed, the arguer would have to provide specific examples to support that statistic. When you choose to quote the words of someone else to support your argument, you are using testimony. Another way to describe this is as argument by authority. You are then using the credibility of someone else to support your point. There are two types of testimony, testimony of fact and testimony of opinion. When you're using testimony of fact, you are relying upon the credibility of another, someone that the audience would consider to be an expert source, through statements of the facts of the situation. In a court of law, attorneys often rely upon expert witnesses to help them make their case. An expert is someone knowledgeable and proficient in their field of work, but even experts are called upon to give their opinions based upon facts. Let's say that you have a medical condition. A doctor, considered an expert, can state facts related to your condition. Your blood pressure is high, your ketones are abnormal, etc. She can also share with you the efficacy and side effects of various treatments. Facts. However, once she says that she thinks you should follow a certain medical protocol, that statement is an opinion. Testimony of opinion, then, is using the credibility of another to support an argument through that person's opinions of the situation. You don't have to visit a court of law to realize that two or more experts equally qualified can often draw completely opposite opinions. Please note, just because a testimony addresses the facts of an issue does not necessarily mean it's superior to testimony of opinion. What someone claims is a fact may in fact be wrong, and oftentimes someone who is offering an opinion will word that opinion as fact. If we were in a classroom right now, I would have you actually practice finding examples of artifacts, specific instances, hypothetical examples, statistics, and testimonies of both fact and value. However, there is nothing stopping you from doing this on your own. Pick up a newspaper or a magazine or surf the internet to find examples of each of these types of evidence. Processing time. Can you identify where evidence fits in the Toolman model of argument? What are the different types of evidence? What is the relationship between specific instances and statistics? And what is the difference between testimonies of fact and testimonies of opinion? Now it should be easy for you to recognize what evidence is, as well as how it's used.